Welcome, everyone. This is your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Thank you so much for coming to another live stream on this special Saturday afternoon edition. We have a lot to get to, and we have a very special guest in Professor Mohammad Marandi. I'm going to introduce him in a second, but make sure you hit the like button because that helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm and gets more viewers here. Right now, everyone, Israel is running a victory lap, seeking to portray itself as all-powerful and dominant, bombing Yemen, threatening Iran with war, and telling the world that it will destroy anyone and anything that gets in the way of their genocidal ambitions. But is this victory lap premature? In recent weeks, the resistance has received a huge boost from Yemen's Ansar Allah, and renewed fighting between Hezbollah and Israel could ignite at any moment as the ceasefire expires at the end of January. Iran's Great Prophet military exercises in recent days have sent a massive warning to Israel that the Islamic Republic is ready for war if war comes to it. To discuss all of this and more, I would like to introduce Professor Mohammad Marandi. He is a professor of English, I believe it is, at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Danny.
Of course, of course. Well, let's get right to it and make sure everyone you hit the like button so we are able to get as many viewers watching Professor Marandi's insights as possible. My first question, though, Professor Marandi, the last 48 hours have seen Ansar Allah in Yemen carry out several military operations. This includes the targeting of U.S. aircraft. There's a bombing campaign happening as we speak. The aircraft carrier USS Truman was targeted with ballistic missiles, and it was forced out of the northern Red Sea over 1,000 kilometers away. And this was achieved using drones and, as I said, cruise missiles. Now, we also know that the Yemeni armed forces, Ansar Allah, has also carried out several strikes in Jaffa as well as in Tel Aviv. Professor Marandi, talk about what the significance of all of this is. This past month has seen a lot of people look at the situation negatively, and Israel boast about its dominant position. But Ansar Allah has repeatedly broken the Iron Dome and has stood up to the United States and the UK in a big way. What is the significance of all of this in your estimation?
Those who believe that the Israeli regime has won, they are badly mistaken. I don't see things that way at all. As you rightly point out, Ansarullah is a very effective fighting force. The armed forces of Yemen are making the fight against the resistance much more costly by driving the U.S. Navy away and the U.S. aircraft carrier away from the shores of Yemen. It makes it much more costly for the Americans to carry out flights, whether it's airstrikes or reconnaissance. The Israeli strikes are very costly for the Israeli regime, and they get extensive support from the United States, just like they did when they attacked Iran. It's the United States really that enables these attacks, but these strikes are very costly for the regime. And we have to remember the Saudis were carrying out years of airstrikes day and night against Yemen, and so were the Emiratis with their billions of dollars of money, and they lost the war. They had to accept a ceasefire. The Israeli regime, even though the Americans give them what they need, they don't have those hundreds of billions of dollars that the Saudis did and wasted, and that the Emirates wasted. So this is every airstrike against Yemen is going to be very costly. The Israeli regime can't do anything that the Americans haven't done already, and Yemen, by firing these very inexpensive drones and inexpensive missiles, because they're produced by Yemen, they're not produced by some expensive Western company. They spend a little, and their enemies spend a lot. So each missile that strikes Tel Aviv or any other city in Palestine, that creates a lack of confidence for foreigners, for investors, for Israelis who are thinking of leaving and more should think seriously about leaving. So Yemen is in a very strong position. And even though the Americans have been bombing it, and we saw a joint operation by the Americans and the Israelis and the, the, their sidekick, the British, uh, it's not having an impact. So obviously, uh, this is just going to cost them more. Every time they carry out these strikes and reconnaissance missions, it costs them a lot of money, and the Yemenis are successful in still successful in carrying out their operations. And of course, Yemen is a country which has defeated many invaders in the past. And so it's literally impossible for the Americans to do much more than what they've already done. One thing that you did mention in your introduction that I want to discuss briefly, and that is something that I've stopped speaking about because some people um, uh, respond negatively. But you said that Iran's carrying out these military maneuvers to warn the Israelis that Iran's ready for war. That is absolutely correct. They're not just warning the Israelis; they're warning the Americans. And Iran's capabilities have been, I think, used across the country to prepare it for any eventual conflict. However, the Iranian response to Israel for its strike on Iran, regardless of the fact that its impact on Iran was very limited, but Iran is going to strike back at Israel. Don't think that no one should imagine that Iran has decided not to respond to the Israeli regime strike. It will be a very painful strike, and it will happen. I remember last time round, a lot of people began criticizing me. Of course, I'm not a decision maker, and people can just criticize me and attack me all they want. But I think the last person to to say this was what's his name, Pierce Morgan, and then literally hours later, the Iranians attacked. The Iranians will strike the Israeli regime, and it will be a very significant strike. So the resistance is alive and well. We see that Hamas and Islamic Jihad continue to strike the Israeli regime. The regime continues to give casualties, and they've had a number of casualties in the last few hours. Hezbollah is preparing for the next phase, and if the Israeli regime does not leave southern Lebanon, then they will pay the price. But also, the Israeli regime is in a difficult situation in Syria because they've occupied 40% of the country's water reserves. They've occupied an enormous amount of territory, including key heights. But they have to protect them. They have to control them. They are overstretched. So now they have, and they cannot retreat because these fanatics in Tel Aviv and elsewhere think that this is going to be their territory. So they are overstretched. If there's going to be conflict with Hezbollah, they are vulnerable. Of course, Turkey and Al Qaeda, they're not going to do anything against the Israeli regime, as we know. This whole overthrow of the Syrian government was a joint operation carried out between Erdogan, Netanyahu, and Biden. And I think over the past few weeks, those who've been critical have been vindicated. We've seen ethnic cleansing happen in Syria. We've seen public executions. We've been seeing people disappear and their bodies being found. We've seen public torture. And these people are so brutal and so barbaric that they do it in front of cameras. It's fine for them. But if you've noticed, and I'm sure you have, and so have your viewers, that we don't see any of this on Western media. In fact, I saw a clip, I think, of a BBC journalist or BBC reporter. She was on Democracy Now! Or something, and she was basically justifying the ethnic cleansing and the killing of the Alawites. She was saying that they were guilty. That's how I wasn't listening carefully, but she seemed to be justifying what Al Qaeda was doing. So um, I think what's happening in Syria is a vindication of Iran's position, that Iran was always saying that we're no fans of the Ba'athist Party and the Ba'athist Party rule in Syria, just as we weren't fans of Iraq, but they were infinitely preferable to Al Qaeda and ISIS, these monsters that Erdogan and NATO and Obama and oil and gas rich countries in the Persian Gulf created. Um, both in Afghanistan in the 1980s and then later on in Syria and elsewhere. So, but in any case, the Israelis are overstretched. They are in they have to keep troops in parts of Syria, and that's going to make it more difficult for them if the ceasefire collapses in Lebanon. And also, they have to be prepared for a collapse of the ceasefire with Hezbollah, and they have to have troops in the West Bank and, as I said, in Syria. So we're going to see a significant Iranian strike. Yemen is causing a lot of trouble. Hezbollah is keeping Israeli troops, significant portion of them, in the north. And also Israel, by taking so much Syrian territory, they are humiliating Al Qaeda. They're humiliating Jolani. I prefer to continue calling him Jolani. And as I prefer saying HTS, calling HTS Al Qaeda, because that's who they are. And it's also humiliating Erdogan, who always pretended that he was a supporter of the Palestinian people. He has done nothing but support sectarian death squads. He's allowed the Israelis to take so much of Syria, and he continues to give transport cheap oil from Baku, among other things, to Netanyahu. So I don't see things nearly as negatively as some of your viewers do, or some friends of mine, both inside and outside Iran. And I should also point one other thing, and I know it's not linked to your question, but Syria has, despite the misery that people are facing in Syria, and things are not good at all. There are all sorts of shortages. There's a lot of, and the violence and the assassinations and the murders, all that aside, there's a lot of trouble inside Syria. And the burden has been lifted off of Iran's shoulders. Iran has been spending perhaps up to five, if not more than $5 billion a year to help the Syrian economy. The Russians were paying as well, and so were the Iraqis. That burden has been lifted, and it is for Mr. Erdogan to start coughing up money to support ISIS and Al Qaeda.
Yes, and this view, Professor Marandi, that you hold, Ansar Allah also holds a very defiant stance right now. During the bombing campaign, we had a 1 million person march happening in the capital of Yemen, in Sana'a, and what they were chanting was, "We are in solidarity with Gaza. We will not let your airstrikes deter us." This is really interesting too, because what Ansar Allah has demonstrated in conjunction as a new additional member of the Axis of Resistance is that it has not just the ability to resist the bombing campaigns and the attempts to destroy them, but it also has the ability to send a missile, which not even the United States owns, a hypersonic missile, in just 11 minutes into Israel, which is over 2,000 kilometers away. I mean, this is actually huge stuff that not many people are covering. Your thoughts, Professor Marandi?
Well, the people of Yemen are very sophisticated people. As we all know, Iran helps Yemen. Iran helps Gaza. The fact that Hamas and its allies continue to fight, the fact that they are successful is because Iran continues to support them. Iran has its ways of supporting Gaza. It's been doing it for many years. That's how the tunnels were built. That's how the weapon systems were created. And they will continue to do so. And they're doing so as we speak. No one else, it's no one but Iran. And the same is true with Yemen. But you have to have young, sophisticated people in Gaza. You have to have young, sophisticated people in Yemen. You have to have young, sophisticated people in Lebanon to be able to carry out these projects. So in the West, they like to ridicule Yemen or the people of Yemen, but they are very sophisticated, very competent, and they are causing a lot of trouble. But what is really despicable and sickening is that the Americans and the British and the Israeli regime, they bombed Sana'a, the capital, while people were protesting against the genocide, against the Holocaust. They bombed the city very close to where people were protesting. That is an ugly act of terrorism being carried out by the regime in Washington and the regime in London. Truly despicable. I can only think of once when in Iran people were protesting and Saddam Hussein tried to bomb the Friday prayers, which caused actually people to come in much larger numbers the week after. And but the point is that this is truly despicable. I mean, we expect all this sort of thing from the Israeli regime. It is a supremacist regime. It considers non-Zionists to be non-Jewish Zionists to be Amalek and subhuman, and so for them to bomb people as they're protesting on the streets is normal. They're slaughtering the people of Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza every day. They slaughter Lebanese families who support the resistance. They've been doing it all the time. They'd be bombing Syria under the Assad government regularly, and they never cared about civilians or innocent people. But for the Americans to get involved and for the British to get involved and to bomb these cities as people are protesting against genocide, I think is a new low for these two regimes.
But will it work, Professor Marandi? Because some may look at what Ansar Allah does and the state of the axis of resistance and believe that even these strikes, I mean, you have millions of Israelis, you have running to bomb shelters at any given time just because Ansar Allah is firing their ballistic missiles and their hypersonic missiles into Israel. And we saw the panic at the Ben Gurion airport, the successful strike on the power plant, the Ribat power plant. But some may say, well, is this enough to really change the calculus? I see that Israel and the United States and the UK are actually obsessing quite a lot about how they are going to stop Ansar Allah. And some I've seen in mainstream publications have said that it might be worth Israel actually conceding something to the Palestinians in order to stop what Ansar Allah is doing, because they don't believe, some of these think tankers don't believe that this will stop anytime soon, and it could get a lot worse. Your thoughts?
Well, that was the objective from day one. Ansar Allah, the Yemeni armed forces, the Yemeni government, were saying that we are implementing the Genocide Convention. We are blockading the Israeli regime in order to stop the genocide. And instead of blocking the genocide, or instead of ending the genocide, the Americans, because they could have blocked it a year ago, they could have blocked it 13, 14, 15 months ago. All they had to do was tell the Israelis, we won't give you the weapons to slaughter these women and children. But they enabled it. So did the Europeans and the Germans and everyone else. But Ansar Allah was saying that we're going to continue this blockade until the genocide stops. So basically what these think tankers are saying is what was the objective of Ansar Allah from the very beginning. That was the objective of Hezbollah. Even now, the 60-day ceasefire in Lebanon is not a permanent ceasefire. Israelis cannot go home, or their army cannot go to the south. They have to be prepared for war because it is an unstable situation, and Hezbollah is determined to expel them from the land. So all of this has been done. The sacrifices made by Hezbollah, and Hezbollah in particular, because they're right beside Palestine. At least Ansarullah in Yemen have the luxury of being further away. But Hezbollah has faced the brunt of these genocidal attacks. They've made huge sacrifices for the people of Gaza. They, and willingly, the sacrifice that Hezbollah has made for Palestine, I think, is extraordinary. They made these sacrifices without being pushed into doing so. Now, they're being attacked in Lebanon by their enemies and by the West and by collaborators and by those aligned to the West. They're being conspired against by Qatar and others who pretend to be supporters of Palestine. So all the masks have been removed. One of the wonderful things, if I could say it that way, one of the wonderful things about these 15 months is that if anyone has open eyes, they see the truth now. They see the truth about countries in the Persian Gulf. They see it about Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, everyone who's been pretending to support Palestine. They see the truth about the relationship between ISIS and Al Qaeda in the West, those who are promoting these groups and saying they're just freedom fighters. See the footage. Everyone has been exposed. Everyone has been exposed. Some people want to keep their eyes closed. That's we can't do anything about that. You can't force people to open their eyes. But for everyone else, it's clear as day who's siding with who's sacrificing, and who's taking advantage of the sacrifice of others. Who took advantage of the sacrifice of Hezbollah? So, but Hezbollah is steadfast. They're powerful, and Hezbollah is preparing itself. And for those who think that Hezbollah is not able to get what it needs, all they have to do is look at Gaza. How does Iran get what Gaza needs? What weapons? What machinery they need under these circumstances? It gets there. How do they get what needs to be taken to Yemen? Right now, the situation for to be very blunt, it's easier for Hezbollah to work through Syria, because when you had the government of President Assad, especially over the last few years, they distanced themselves from the resistance, and they tilted towards Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And we saw that they were not allowing Hezbollah to use their territory to bring in assets. There are all sorts of difficulties. They expelled the bulk of the Iranian forces that were being used to fight ISIS and Al Qaeda, to their own detriment, of course. And Iran continued to prop up the government, and so did the Russians. Bring free oil. Iran gave 60,000 barrels a day at least of oil, and all sorts of other aid and assistance to Syria. But because Iran had to respect the sovereignty of the Syrian government, they couldn't just send anything they wanted into Lebanon. But now it's very easy. All they have to do is use the systems that the methods that are being used everywhere else. And these are, how do they get weapons and machinery and other things into Gaza? It's the same thing. People will do it for you very inexpensively.
Yeah, I think people misunderstand Hezbollah. They believe that because their leadership was decapitated, because they chose to engage in a ceasefire after a successful stand against Israel's attempted ground invasion, and of course the just absolute horrific and ongoing in some respects bombing campaign that Israel engaged in, that this was a sign of weakness. Hezbollah was done. The pager attacks, all of this.
May I just add something, Danny?
Yes.
Just one thing. Hezbollah immediately, of course, replaced its leader. It replaced the commanders. it defeated the Israelis. The Israelis could not gain any territory, any significant. They couldn't make any significant inroads into Lebanon. But Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, Hamas controls Gaza, and its allies help it, like Islamic Jihad. Lebanon is not controlled by Hezbollah, as you're seeing today. It has tens of Western embassies whose job is to conspire against Hezbollah, whose job it is to conspire against Palestine in the resistance. There are many.
Professor Marandi, we're having a bit of a connection problem. If you can hear me.
This little Western NGOs, than I think anywhere else on the planet. I can.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we were having a bit of a connection problem for about.
Is it better now?
Yes. So continue.
Okay.
You were talking about how Hezbollah does not have control over Lebanon, does not have political leadership over Lebanon.
Yes, you have tens of Western embassies that conspire against Hezbollah in the resistance. You have more NGOs in this small country, Western NGOs, well-funded NGOs, than anywhere else in the world, all of them conspiring against the resistance. And then you have these fascist groups like Sami Ja'ja's Lebanese forces, among others, who are willing to wage war against Hezbollah if they can. So Hezbollah, while it's fighting against the Israeli regime in defense of Gaza and defense of Palestine, it is constantly being stabbed in the back. And you see right now how the collective West and Qatar and others, all of them have been conspiring against the resistance in Lebanon. So despite all that, Hezbollah, and then the Israelis were the ones who requested a ceasefire. And it was the Lebanese government that was insisting that because of the pressure coming from the pro-Western camp and the pro-Israeli camp in Lebanon, they were putting pressure on Hezbollah to accept a ceasefire. So Hezbollah, despite the fact that it has it does not control Lebanon, it won the war. The Israelis made no inroads, but Hezbollah does not have the advantage that Hamas does, in that it does not, as I said, does not control the land. It does not control the capital.
Yes, and just to finish my thought, Hezbollah has been in very difficult conditions before. It started out in very difficult conditions in the 1980s and has built itself up into this huge fighting force, really a military force as much as it is a resistance force. And so to believe that, these setbacks that were incurred, the terrorism, the decapitation is going to stop them from fighting after the ceasefire expires, if it comes to that, I think is a huge miscalculation, especially since Israel has already made it clear they have no interest at all in not only complying with the ceasefire, because they've violated that 1,000 times, but they have no interest at all in withdrawing from southern Lebanon. And that is not going to be tolerated or in perpetuity. Definitely, definitely not. But Professor Marandi, I wanted to ask you now about these military exercises by Iran. Israeli media, Channel 12 media, Jerusalem Post, they were framing these exercises, the Great Prophet exercises, which are going to span months, as almost an act of desperation, that a lot of the operations were occurring around nuclear sites. But then, according not only to Iranian media, but also to those who are actually following this exercise, we've seen some things be unveiled by Iran. For example, underground, massive missile cities, huge stockpiles of anti-aircraft ballistic missiles, and even these missiles that we've seen Yemen and Ansarallah use to take down MQ-9 Reaper drones. We've seen them unveiled and deployed around these so-called nuclear sites in Iran. Talk about the significance of these exercises, especially the timing of them as we've entered this new year, because Israel and the United States have both been saying, Iran is defeated, Iran is isolated because the rest of the axis of resistance is defeated and isolated.
Well, first of all, the rest of the axis of resistance is very much intact. Yemen, as we've been discussing, in Iraq, they're very much there. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah is preparing itself for the next phase. The only thing that the West and their Israeli allies can speak of as an achievement is Syria. That's it. There's nothing else. There's, in fact, as I said before on your show, that the greatest defeat is the fact that the world has seen the Israeli regime as a brutal and barbaric and illegitimate regime. That is the biggest defeat of all. That should make them desperate, not Iran. That, I think, is this is the beginning of the end of the Israeli regime, because they can no longer hide behind the Holocaust. They can no longer hide behind anti-Semitism, and people see through it. Have seen through everything. Even in the West, people are now seeing through it. The rest of the world, they know exactly what's going on. So the regime no longer has legitimacy. No matter the Americans can keep sending the weapons, but it has no legitimacy in the eyes of the world. And of course, in the region, they're despised in ways that I think are just unimaginable. It would have been unimaginable just a couple of years ago. So that I think is the biggest defeat. But again, in Syria was a burden to Iran. Iran under sanctions despite the collective West working against it and its regional allies like Turkey and countries in the Persian Gulf region, or I should say Erdogan, but regimes in the Persian Gulf, all of them working and collaborating with the West. It's a big burden supporting the Palestinians and the resistance. So the burden of Syria is no longer on Iran's shoulders. And until now, Iranians were being attacked and sectarian. These Wahhabi extremists were using sectarian propaganda against Iran. As I said earlier, Iran's been vindicated, and Iran no longer has to give Syria free oil. They can sell it on the market and use it for other purposes. Now the burden is on of Al Qaeda, as I said, is on Qatar and Turkey, and now we see huge differences emerging. The Saudis and the Emiratis are increasingly worried. So are the Egyptians and the Jordanians. They're worried about Qatar.
Well, Professor Marandi, also Israel is talking about a panel of Israeli defense experts have recommended to the Knesset and to the defense ministry that war with Turkey may be more important than war with Iran. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, but I don't take I don't take that seriously. As long as there's Erdogan. I mean, Erdogan has been giving oil to Netanyahu to help him carry out this Holocaust. Turkey under Erdogan is very vulnerable. We saw that when that pastor was arrested years ago, accused of participating in the coup, as soon as Trump imposed or threatened to impose meaningful sanctions and did impose very symbolic sanctions, the Turkish economy was hit very hard, and he immediately released the pastor. So Erdogan is not going to stand up against the West. His position on Gaza has always been hypocritical. He wants his sphere of influence in Syria, and he did a deal with the devil, and he's been doing that for since 2011. You cannot be, I mean, the person who helped create ISIS, and we remember what ISIS did in Syria and Iraq at its height, when it would burn people alive and cut people's throats, and that little kid cutting off the head of that man, and now he's in Damascus. This is not the this is not the work of a person of principle. So I don't take him seriously, but Turkey, of course, as a country, Turkey, and the people of Turkey, they are staunch supporters of the Palestinian people and the resistance. But the hypocrisy, I think, of Netanyahu, for those who again keep their eyes open or who have opened their eyes, I think it's clear for everyone to see. But the point I wanted to make about the maneuver of desperation, as the Israelis would like to see it, is that Iran is preparing itself and is sending a message not to the Israeli regime, but to the Americans. Because when Iran strikes the Israeli regime, first of all, Iran has to prepare itself, because since Syria no longer exists and the Israelis have destroyed, under Jolani, they've destroyed all of Syria's infrastructure, Iran has to prepare itself for any attack that uses Syrian airspace. So that is one reason why they had to delay their retaliation against the Israeli regime. But also, the Iranians have to prepare themselves for a potential attack by the Americans. If the Americans choose to get involved, the Iranians have to be prepared to strike back very hard. And the Iranians want the Americans to see that they're prepared. So a lot of the things that have been unveiled were also done so to send a message to the Americans. And those tiny regimes, oil and gas rich regimes, that host Americans and American bases in the Persian Gulf region. Because if the Americans attack Iran and they have bases in these tiny countries, then they are complicit. And of course, that would mean the end of the global economy. And so the Iranians are basically sending a message to the Americans, and they're preparing themselves to punish the Israelis. And of course, after they punish the Israelis may think of striking Iran again. So they have to prepare themselves for the Americans, for the Israelis. But have no doubt that Iran is fully prepared. Iran will punish the Israeli regime, and the resistance is not weakened. Syria was always the weakest link. It was a vulnerable and broken country. The Americans emptied it out. The Europeans and others and Erdogan destroyed the country with their dirty war and with the sanctions. And now it's broken and they own it. They are the ones who have to pay for the fuel. They are the ones who have to keep the turn on the electricity and keep the electricity on and keep the cars moving on the streets. It's not Iran's responsibility anymore. It's they who have to bring in flour and keep the economy moving, not Iran or anyone else. So I don't see this. I think this is going to be a huge burden for Erdogan. Is something that he's going to regret. And we see that these extremists are, as I said, already carrying out ethnic cleansing. They are hostile towards the different minorities. They are in conflict with the Kurds. I don't think the negotiations are going to get anywhere with the Kurds. So Mr. Erdogan is going to have he's causing a lot of trouble for his country. If he had done a deal with the Syrian government under Assad, and then the Kurdish issue would have been resolved. But right now, I don't think it's going to be that easy at all.
Yeah, and as someone who opposed for over a decade, ever since 2011, regime change in Syria, it was very difficult to watch that occur. However, it was very clear in the last several years that the economic war on Syria and the continuation and the degradation and attempts to weaken Syria had actually done that. And we just, at least I myself, admit that it was something that wasn't necessarily on the radar. And in part, the reason why, and I've been considering this, Professor Marandi, is because the axis of resistance has been resisting so valiantly over the last since October 7, 2023. And Ansarallah is, many people say it's an addition, even though it never, it's not like it didn't exist before October 7th, 2023. But a lot of people, because, as you said, it stepped up in the genocide with the Genocide Convention, it's going to adhere to it. It was going to enact consequences on Israel. Because of that, people view that as, well, now they are in this. And then, of course, we've had the Palestinian resistance continue. We've had Hezbollah take a stand and really stand up to the Israeli regime in the U.S. So all of this, I think, kept our eyes off of Syria. But still, I'm curious, Professor Marandi, because people ask me, well, if Iran is this strong, if Iran has these capabilities like it is showing in the Great Prophet exercise, the military exercises, then why doesn't it take a stand? Because I think after Syria, what people have been saying is, well, Iran made a huge mistake not doing Operation True Promise 3, and it's led to severe consequences because there was this alignment between Syria and the ceasefire that Hezbollah engaged in. So how do you answer this question, Professor Marandi, about why hasn't Iran used these capabilities to punish Israel and punish the United States in turn? Because both of them, as you said, are threatening war. The United States, right before Israel has been saying we're going to try to strike Israel's nuclear sites, the United States was revealed to also be seeking to do something very similar.
Well, first, I have to remind everyone that the country that is funding the axis of resistance, despite the maximum pressure of sanctions, is Iran. So all of those people who are hostile towards Iran and who are saying Iran's doing nothing, what are they doing? They're not doing anything. Their governments are actually, many of them at least, are assisting Israel. Turkey's government is assisting Israel. They've assisted the genocide. They have, not only do they have intelligence, high-ranking intelligence meetings with one another, they have diplomatic relations, they have business ties which continue as we speak, and most importantly, they're continuing to send oil even after Netanyahu was given an arrest warrant. So they had every excuse to end this. And if Erdogan told Aliyev and Baku to end the trade, he would have done it. There are no excuses. These are just apologists for those who are saying otherwise. They're apologists for Erdogan, and they're apologists for ISIS and Al Qaeda and all the beheadings and the burning of people alive and all the things that we've been seeing since 2011 and what we're seeing today in Syria. They're apologists. But so if these regimes, the resistance doesn't even need Mr. Erdogan to help, or Mr. Sisi to help, or Mr. Mohammed bin Zayed to help. All they had to do was just, or Abdullah, all they had to do was just stop helping Israel. They don't need to help the resistance. But they helped the Israeli regime throughout this period, all of them. People demonstrate in Turkey to support the Palestinian people, but the government hasn't done anything. People, despite the risks, go to the streets in Jordan, but the regime is helping the Israeli people, the Israeli regime. So the burden is on Iran's shoulders. Every bullet fired by Hamas, someone has to pay for it. Every tunnel that is built, someone has to pay for it. Whether in Yemen or in Lebanon or elsewhere or in Iraq, every drone that's fired, every missile, someone has to pay for it. So imagine the burden that is. And the other side has the collective West giving it everything it wants. And all the Western intelligence agencies and the Five Eyes, all the way from New Zealand, they're part of this Holocaust, to Canada, from Australia to Austria, all of them are a part of this genocide. They're all invested in this genocide. So it's no joke. It's no small burden for Iran. Second of all, Iran simply cannot just fire away. Iran has to have a reason to fire so that the world does not turn against Iran. Because if, for example, countries that are sympathetic to Palestine but they have good relations with the Israeli regime, whether we like it or not. If they see Iran simply firing at Israel, they're going to turn against Iran. The very same BRICS countries that we all want to work closely to one another. If they see Iran firing away day and night, do you think they're going to support Iran? No, of course not. So Iran has to be calculated. Iran's true promise two, the previous one, the first missile strike that they did against Israel, was after Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred. Now, as you recall, it was delayed because of the negotiations over the ceasefire, because the Iranians, and Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah himself said this during that period when it was delayed. He said the logic was that if Iran fired while the negotiations were taking place, even though people like myself, people like you and your audience, most of us never believed that there was going to be a ceasefire. Maybe some diplomats were naive enough to believe it, but none of, our diplomats, Western diplomats, they're part of this conspiracy. But the Iranians, even whether our diplomats or any diplomats, or maybe they didn't believe it, I don't know. But still, if Iran had fired the missiles while the negotiations or the fake negotiations were taking place, they would have made this an issue about Iran, and so would have the same people in our region who are attacking Iran in the resistance today and who are supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria. They would have said, look, the Iranians don't want a ceasefire in Palestine. They don't care about the Palestinian people. They're using the Palestinian people for their own agenda. That's exactly what they would have said, because they're utter hypocrites. The people who are supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda, the people who continue to business and trade with the Israelis, these are hypocrites, and they're the ones with the media. All this Arabic media and the English media, and they're the ones who control the narratives. So Iran couldn't fire. So the Iranians had to delay its response. But even if Iran had fired earlier, do you think that the Israelis would not have murdered Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah if they could have? They would have struck his command center or the place where he was staying. Of course they would have, whether Iran struck or didn't strike. Whether Iran had struck earlier or later, wouldn't make a difference. The same is true. The same argument I can make with True Promise 3. I don't know the reasons for the delay. All the reasons there's some things I can speculate about, which I don't want to discuss here because they're just my own speculations. And I know a lot of people will still say he's informed, and so this must be the truth. And so I will refrain. I have the disadvantage from your other guests, in that some people really mistakenly believe that I have insider information. If I had insider information, I wouldn't be speaking, because that's not how it works in any government. I would have to be very quiet. But I'm just a citizen, but I can guess. But one thing that has caused the delay, in my opinion, is the fall of Syria, because Iran had to rethink its defense, air defense capabilities. They would have to move things around because Syrian airspace is now open for the Israeli regime. However, and this is where I'm answering the question, if Iran had carried out True Promise 3 a month ago, or let's say a week before the Al Qaeda and ISIS forces and their affiliates attacked Aleppo and we saw the beginning of the fall of Syria, do you think if Iran had struck back then, it would have changed the situation on the ground in Syria? Of course not. It has nothing to do with Syria. It wouldn't have motivated the Syrian army because Iran was firing missiles or drones into Palestine. That has nothing to do with it. Just like the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has nothing to do with Iranian missile strikes against the Israeli regime. But Iran has a shot, and it will use it, and it wants to use it to maximum effect. It wants to use its retaliation to maximum effect, and it will happen. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Again, I'm not a decision maker, but based on my understanding of Iran, it will happen. But if Iran had carried out this strike, would it have changed the equation in Syria? Definitely not. Would it, if Iran had carried out the previous strike before Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred, would it have changed that? Definitely not. But there are other calculations that are at play, and people who are emotional and angry, and they should be emotional and angry. Every day we're seeing kids being slaughtered, and the Western apologists and Western media justifying it and supporting it. It's understandable that people get angry, but it's a heavy burden for Iran. And if there's anyone else who wants to have it, I mean, if Turkey under Erdogan had shared the burden, there would be no Israel. But Erdogan did the exact opposite. So this is a heavy burden that Iran carries, and so does the rest of the resistance. But Iran will definitely strike the Israeli regime, and Iran is preparing itself for a potential war. Not that I believe that the Americans will attack, but the Iranians have to show the Americans and their allies that they're prepared in order to prevent an attack.
Oh, most definitely, especially since it's not as if there aren't forces in the United States' foreign policy establishment, ruling elite that want they want it. So of course Iran has to prepare, and I think all your considerations are definitely important to take into account, given the fact that an all-out war in the region is and would be an absolute disaster, and one that would spell a major setback for BRICS, a major setback for multipolarity, a major setback for Iran, but also a major setback for peace. And this is a protracted war, I believe, and it is one that is going to have ebbs and flows. But right now, given that Iran has been able to show off these capabilities, I think it's clear that Israel and the United States are on notice. They are on notice that if they do try to conduct a regime change operation in the middle of this genocide and absolute cauldron in West Asia, that they will pay the price for it. And people should take this seriously and should also perhaps shift their focus onto, I think the Turkey example is so good, because shift the focus onto those who are actually not only not doing anything about this, but also partly responsible for this kind of chaos that we are seeing in the region. Now, Professor Marandi, I wanted to ask you.
Well, just one thing.
Sure.
Of course, I would say Erdogan and the people around him. Otherwise, the people of Turkey are very sincere in their support for the Palestinians. But just a couple of you know when Iran, those who think Iran is weak. Iran was weak when Saddam Hussein invaded the country, and both blocs, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, the Americans and the Soviet Union, assisted Saddam Hussein. That's when Iran was weak. When was Iran vulnerable? When the United States invaded Afghanistan and then invaded Iraq in 2013 and surrounded Iran. That's when Iran was weak. The United States was at the height of its power. Someone called it a hyperpower. It was a unique moment in world history. It was a unipolar moment. That's when Iran was vulnerable. But even then, the Americans never dared attack Iran because they knew that it was a war they couldn't win. Today, Iran's military capabilities are very advanced. Iran has the most sophisticated weapon systems made inside the country by far compared to any other country in this region. Iran has hypersonic missiles, which the Western camp doesn't have. It's producing them, and it's also assisting other countries. So the United States is not, and then Iran has its allies are spread out across the region. And if there was a regional war, what would happen to oil prices? The Americans just now sanctioned the Russians and their oil business and trade. Oil went up. Imagine if there's a war in the Persian Gulf region. The war in the oil and gas in the Persian Gulf would be non-existent. And the same is true in the Caucasus. What would happen to the global economy? It would collapse. And then you would have people on the move across Latin America and Asia and Africa in numbers that are unimaginable today as the economies in Europe and the United States collapse. So it would be catastrophic for the West. So no one wants this war. but there is a balance of terror today. So those who think Iran is weak, I don't think they're very good at reading history. Ansarullah, if they can hold their own, you have no doubt that Iran can do infinitely more to its adversaries. But in any case, I'm waiting for Iran to punish the Israeli regime, and I think when it does, then a lot of people will feel much better. But Israel will not be finished tomorrow. This is a process. Zionism will collapse. The very fact that the world sees it for what it is, that is the biggest victory to take away from all of what's happened in the last few months.
Indeed. And Professor Marandi, now I would like to shift focus on to uh, to what you had just referenced there in terms of Israel and its current situation. So, Israel is committing still the genocide and massacres in Gaza. However, there have been some interesting reports and developments around this victory lap that Israel is currently running. So, as Israel has been boasting about essentially defeating the axis of resistance, we've seen even in Gaza pretty intense fighting all across the Gaza Strip, especially in the north. And Israeli troops, Israeli Defense Force, occupation forces are incurring significant casualties. Now, we have Israeli settler parents protesting Netanyahu, saying that this is a forever war that is creating huge problems economically, but socially as well for the soldiers who are seeing and witnessing and participating in these crimes. And then you have reports that Hamas and the Palestinian resistance is essentially the same size as it was, or very close to the same size as it was prior to the October 7th October 7th gambit and resistance action that the Palestinian resistance waged. Now, this, some say, is about Israel labeling all Palestinians as Hamas in order to continue their genocide, while others say that this is an example of how Palestinians are resisting this genocide. What do you make of these reports and these developments in light of the fact that right now Israel seems to be stretching itself out more with wars against Yemen, gearing up again against Hezbollah, threatening Iran, but yet in Gaza we see this ongoing fighting that simply has no end. How is this going to turn out for the Israeli regime in the United States that backs it?
Well, I should also add that Hezbollah today is larger and has more forces than it did 6 months ago, than it did a year ago. A lot of young people have decided to join the resistance in Lebanon, young people who weren't a part of the resistance until recently. So it shows that the resilience of the resistance is extraordinarily high, and I think it's something that demoralizes the Israeli regime, and that's what's leading to these families protesting because they see no hope in a victory. They can take their victory lap, but they have to be careful that they're not sniped during the victory lap while they're taking that victory lap. They've won nothing. They've gained nothing. And remember, Danny, there's a war going on in Ukraine, and even it was supposed to end on January the 21st, I think, based on what Trump promised earlier. But even that is going to continue for now, and that is a burden for the West. And the West is intensifying the war. You see how the Europeans and their foolishness, and the Americans under Biden, out of spite, in order to corner Trump, they are intensifying the war, and they are increasing the sanctions against Russia. All of this is an extra burden for the West. So while the West is paying for the Holocaust, they're also paying for the war in Ukraine. They're paying because of the sanctions are not, they hurt Russia, but they hurt the West just as much as they hurt Russia, if not much more. Some of the sanctions hurt the West much more. Some of them do hurt both sides. But the West is being hurt more than the Russians. So the West they are paying for wars. They are paying for military bases across the world. They're paying for the Holocaust in Gaza and countries across the global South. They are building. They're building their countries. China is building. The main rival, the main concern of the United States is China. So the West is depleting itself. It is growing weaker. I'm not saying it's going to fall apart tomorrow, but it is going to be. This is all a burden. It's not. It's a burden that the West bears. Look at the fire in Los Angeles. The lack of infrastructure, the incompetence of the regime. Compare it to the United States of 40 years ago, which back then the United States was like China today, way ahead of everyone else. These wars cannot go on forever. These wars, of course, it's destroyed the West, it's destroyed their credibility, it's destroyed their image. It has shown young people in the West that their regimes are immoral. They are morally inferior to countries like Iran by far. Iran is infinitely superior to the West, morally speaking. There's no comparison. There's no discussion. But compared to China or Russia or anywhere else, they have nothing to say. They've destroyed themselves. But they're also, this is a financial burden. The Israeli regime is much weaker today than it was before. And the regimes that are backing the Israeli regime are weaker than before and much less credible than before. So, and again, we never, anyone who thought that October the 7th would be like the end of Israel and that it would just fall apart, they are being extremely naive. That would never have happened. This is a process. This is the beginning of the end of the regime. And when you look at history, nothing happens overnight. If you look at, let's say, the Algerian resistance or the Iranian Revolution or any other anti-colonial movement in Africa and Latin America and Asia and elsewhere, if you just look at it in the middle of the movement, it often looks defeated. The revolution in Iran, the Imam Khomeini was exiled from the country for 14 years. In Algeria, you had who knows how many people died. Some numbers say 1.5 million, some say more. Some Algerians were murdered in Paris. At some point, many may have thought that there's never going to be freedom in Algeria. The French are never going to leave. But ultimately, they had to leave. They had to give up. And that I have no doubt is the fate of the Israeli regime. So they can take any victory lap that they like. The Western media is always going to say that Iran lost, the resistance lost, Hezbollah lost, and then those people who did nothing, those people who are ashamed that their own governments did nothing and that they did not take a stand themselves to force their government to change, obviously they have a vested interest in blaming Iran or Hezbollah or Ansarullah or Hamas for what happened because they want to justify their own lack of or their own inaction or the inaction of their government. Some people, most people are part of the resistance today. The resistance, as we've discussed on your show before, it's grown and it exists across the world. People across the world are part of this resistance. I remember early on when the genocide began, there was a young woman in Seoul in South Korea who was protesting every day in front of the Israeli regime's embassy. And then 2-3 months ago, I saw another photo of her, and she was still protesting. There are these unsung heroes exist everywhere across the world. They're in the United States. They're at universities. There are people who are online. There are people who are on the streets. There are people who are doing whatever they can, wherever they can. The resistance is huge. It's a people are more educated. People know what the Nekba is. People know what ethno-supremacism is. People know where these Zionists came from, where they came from Europe or they came from Arab countries, that they're not for the most part Semites, whereas the Palestinians are. This is a sea change. Just a year and a half ago, in Tehran, I had to explain, argue with students, some students in class, that Israel is not a legitimate state, that these people weren't here 100 years ago. Why? Because so few people were following the news. They just thought that these Palestinians there was a fight going on between two groups of people over a piece of land. Young people on my campus, from my students, smart kids who got high scores and got into the University of Tehran. They had many of them, not all of them, but many of them had a complete lack of knowledge of what was going on in Palestine. And it worse than a lack of knowledge. They were being misinformed because in my faculty, the students speak English. They were brought up in with English classes, and many of them their English is excellent. And they were brought up, in an English speaking environment or with Western movies and Western media. So that's where they got their information. But now, no one sees the Israeli regime as legitimate. That is huge, and that is something that we will hopefully all of us build upon to help bring an end to this racist regime and to bring justice to Palestine.
Oh, yeah. Yes, indeed. And Professor Marandi, what you were saying about the vulnerabilities of the Israeli regime that we are witnessing, both on the world stage and on the ground. Uh, when Syria fell, it appeared that Israel was in this very dominant position. It moved into Syria, occupied a larger portion of its land beyond the Golan Heights, now standing just 20 or 30 kilometers from Damascus. But Israel actually hasn't been less than that, yeah. And now, Professor Mardi, of course, they occupy more land in Syria than the size of the Gaza Strip, but they didn't fight anyone. And this is a big problem, I think, for Israel. And I think I think Israel is a microcosm for the empire, as you said. Israel is doing what the United States empire has done around the world, which is spread out as far as it can, attempt to destroy everyone and anything that gets in its way in terms of its ambitions, its desires to dominate, and then of course to reap all the benefits from that domination and subjugation. But now Israel finds itself not only in a forever war in Gaza, which it has no interest in stopping, it finds itself potentially in another protracted conflict with Hezbollah. It is threatening Iran, and we never know whether Israel will actually take another stab at striking Iran, which could, of course, lead Iran to strike back. And as you said, Iran will strike back. And then, of course, you have Yemen, which is not going to stop until the Israeli regime stops. How is it then? How can a society constructed like Israel's, this occupation, this settler colony, this entity, how can it last under these conditions? This is something that Israel's been at war with the Palestinians and committing genocide against them for as long as its existence. But how can it last in a forever war against all of these forces in perpetuity, essentially, as it continues to thump its chest? To me, it just doesn't seem plausible. What's your take?
It cannot fight a week if it wasn't for the enormous support provided by the West. It's not just the direct support, it's the indirect support. It's not just the weapons and the ammunition and the aid, it's also the indirect aid and the support that the institutions in the West give. And then if there's the media support, the Western media is collectively behind Israel. Every now and then you'll get this article, but all of the media, whether the so-called left, like The Guardian, or the right, like Fox News, they're all with the Israelis. They're all with the Holocaust. You just saw the New York Times refrain from publishing an ad that an expensive ad that was that called for the end of the genocide. The New York Times was not willing to have the word genocide published in the newspaper. There is no freedom of speech. This is all, they're all in bed with the Israeli regime. But there are huge cracks emerging. The West is declining financially. The rest of the world is growing. But also in the West, people are waking up. I don't want to read too much into what Trump did. Jeffrey Sachs, his speech at Oxford, I think, I'm not sure, Oxford or Cambridge, when he spoke about Netanyahu and how he on that platform that's affiliated with him, where he reposted it. I mean, I don't have any faith in Trump, obviously. Trump, if you recall, 7 years ago during the Super Bowl when he first became president, O'Reilly interviewed him, and O'Reilly said Putin's a murderer, and then he said, "Well, we've done lots of evil things too," something like that. I don't remember the words. I should take a look. Uh, it didn't mean that Trump was some politically aware person with a sense of morality, but he did say something that was unexpected. By reposting what Jeffrey Sachs says, it just shows that there are differences. That he has a problem with Netanyahu. He doesn't have a problem with the Israeli regime or genocide or the Holocaust in Gaza because he's been supporting it. But the differences and the divisions in the West, as it declines and as these regimes have increasing problems, they are emerging. It's not as if they're all a united front. They may be evil, these leaders, but each in his or her own way. So, Netanyahu. Today, we're seeing people on the left, the real, the progressives, people on the right, like Candace Owens, or speaking out against the Israeli regime. This is completely new to the United States. This is something that we've never seen before, or many of the things that are being said today are being heard by millions of people. So I think that there's a lot of reason to be optimistic. I don't believe that not Trump is going to be any better than Biden. I don't believe that the German regime and the reason why I use regime, by the way, someone once said, well, Marandi criticizes the West for calling Iran a regime, and then he calls them regime all the time. I do it intentionally because I'm reversing I reverse the narrative. If they call Iran, if they are respectful towards Iran, or to countries in the resistance, I'll be respectful to them as well. But in any case, I'm very optimistic, and I don't think that I don't think there's any reason for the Israeli regime or its allies in Washington or Trump or any of these people to be optimistic about the future. Although I do believe that we're going to have difficult days ahead, difficult weeks ahead, difficult months ahead, and difficult years ahead. But I do see light at the end of the tunnel. Today, the situation is immensely different from before. And those who suddenly became so depressed after the fall of Syria, first of all, the Syrian regime was not a wonderful regime. It was preferable, infinitely preferable to these ISIS and Al Qaeda gangsters. But it wasn't a good regime. The Ba'athist regime wasn't a good regime. It was way better than what what NATO and these countries in the Persian Gulf had in store. And we now see it. I don't know if you saw the footage of this guy, this local mayor who they were beating in the head till he died in front of all these kids. These are the monsters that Erdogan and Netanyahu and Biden have empowered. But in any case, I was I'm sure you recall, I was in Beirut when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred. That was much more difficult. During war, the leader of Hezbollah, that one of the people, perhaps, someone loved across the world, was martyred. And his commanders, almost all of them were martyred. And the person who was believed to be his successor was martyred. But Hezbollah stood its ground, and Israel got nothing. And all it can do out of spite and anger is, alongside the border in these villages, it just blows up people's homes out of spite and hatred. That's all it can do. What sort of victory is that? But those days were very dark days. And I remember the Western media saying how bad things were for Hezbollah, and then Israel would constantly carpet bomb Beirut, destroy the Western media would say these are Hezbollah sites or Hezbollah strongholds, or always trying to justify it because they're just as monstrous and evil, these Western journalists, mainstream Western journalists and diplomats and politicians are just as evil and monstrous as Netanyahu. But Hezbollah stood its ground. So I don't see any reason for anyone to be depressed or dejected. Resistance is tough and it's difficult and it has its ups and downs, but we're on the right side, and we do what we have to do, and we will get to where we have to get.
Yeah, and perhaps to close before we get to some audience questions really quickly, Professor Marandi, is I agree with you. I think the situation has changed just absolutely dramatically. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking was how Israel now, the United States now, even Turkey now, although, Turkish government, we can Erdogan, but maybe we can put a pin on them. But in terms of Israel's situation, a lot of people have asked, Danny, why doesn't Iran, why doesn't the axis of resistance as a whole, why don't they? Because you have Ansarallah has very impressive capabilities. Hezbollah, although their capabilities were degraded to an extent, also very impressive capability. Why don't they all unite together and just stop this now? Now, because Israel, after the fall of Syria, is viewed as having toppled such an important piece. And I do think it was a setback to a degree. However, Israel now, you made a great point about needing to take responsibility, right? All these forces, the forces of empire, Israel being one of them, now have to take responsibility over the chaos that they are unleashing. And one thing that I've noticed and I've been observing, and maybe your final comment on this, is that if Israel cannot defeat the resistance in Palestine, if it cannot take on Ansarallah, then in my estimation, Israel has absolutely no capacity to achieve this greater Israel that it is trying to achieve. And I don't think the United States wants to see a greater Israel. I think they want to see Israel continue to do their bidding and allow the United States to be as hegemonic as they can be. But the United States also, I think, realizes that their time is essentially up in the region, and it's only a matter of time until they are going to receive the Afghanistan treatment all across it. So it does seem to me that Israel does not have the capacity to rule and reign. They don't have the capacity to expand the model of its occupation of Palestine beyond some empty land or very sparsely populated land into Syria. And as it extends itself, it is actually going to be fighting harder and harder to try to achieve things I don't believe it has, from what I'm seeing, the capacity to do. Because if Israel was all powerful, it would have already taken over the Gaza Strip and have started to do what I believe Israel wants to do, which is occupy, settle, and create what most colonies in history have wanted, Professor Marandi, which is stability. They don't want to see resistance explode everywhere. That is anathema to a colonial power. And I just don't see Israel ever able to become one of those, in particular because it is hitched upon an empire, the United States, that is also on the decline. Your final thoughts on this before we get to audience questions?
Yes, I agree. By the way, I do believe that the fall of Syria was a tactical defeat, and it was a tactical victory for Netanyahu and his allies in Ankara and in Washington. But in the long run, I think it's the opposite. It decreased the burden from Iran, and $5 billion a year is a burden for Iran, and it's increased the burden on those regimes that have destroyed Syria, and they're going to have to pay for it. They're the ones who are going to, and they're being exposed as they carry out ethnic cleansing against minorities, as their thugs slaughter people and beat people and batter people in front of cameras and gloat about the slaughter. I mean, the Western media can pretend that that these are Assadists or whatever, but it's just like Gaza. In the beginning, remember when they bombed the Al Ahli, what was it, Al Ahli hospital? Uh, and killed hundreds of people. They said no, this was a resistance rocket that hit it. They want to say that, and then when they, it was the underground tunnels, and there was always the West was justifying it. Now they just destroy all the hospitals. No one believes them anymore. No one believes the Israeli narrative. In Syria, no one believes the narrative anymore. No one believes that these are freedom fighters and that this is about freedom and democracy. And those who are still supporting it now, they're becoming increasingly discredited, like the Israeli regime and its apologists. So in the long run, I actually don't even think, and I may have said this on your previous show, I don't even think Mr. Erdogan wanted the Syrian government to fall. I think he wanted, I do
Yeah,
know that the expectation was not even to take Aleppo. The
right.
expectation was for them to reach West Aleppo. I do know that. I have that knowledge. But the fall of Syria has caused a huge dilemma. Till now, Qatar and Turkey were paying for these terrorists inside Idlib. Now they have to pay for the whole country. Now they have to pay people's wages. Now they have to provide oil and electricity. Well, do it. You pay for it now. The country has 15% of the economy that it had in 2010. Imagine, back then it was a thriving country that Mr. Erdogan and NATO and others and Qatar and others destroyed and killed hundreds of thousands of people in the process and created these extremist groups, which are now a threat not to Iran, but to the Western camp. Which countries are most vulnerable to ISIS and Al Qaeda? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey itself. And then Central Asian countries. What they've done to Syria has angered China. They see these Chinese terrorists in the Syrian government. So do Central Asian governments. This is, in the long run, this does not benefit Iran's antagonists or the antagonists of the resistance or the antagonists of the collective resistance. That's what I was trying to say. And then I was speaking about the long run. But also one thing that you mentioned, and that is you were correct that the capabilities of Hezbollah were degraded. The capabilities of Israel were degraded. In war, everyone's capabilities are degraded. In Ukraine, as we expected from day one, Russia is winning the war. But if someone says, is Russia weaker today? In certain ways, of course it is weaker. Because when you fight a war, you pay for it, you lose men, you lose you lose equipment. But relatively speaking, Russia is stronger because its antagonists are much weaker today than they were back then. So it's like I don't watch boxing. I have no, but back then Muhammad Ali was someone who many people love. When he fought, what was it called, the Rumble in the Jungle against Foreman, or the oh that no or the Thriller in Manila, or whatever it was called, with the other one who I forgot. Both men were tired at the end of the fight. Both were depleted. One
Yeah, Professor Marandi, just a little bit of a connection issue if you can hear me.
loses in a fight. Both sides are tired. Yes, I can hear you. I don't know, but can you hear me?
Yeah, I think there's a delay. It started interrupting when I believe you were about to make the point that both sides were tired. Muhammad Ali and who he was fighting were
Yeah.
tired.
So both sides are tired, but one side is much more tired than the other. One side is a bit more tired or much more tired. Russia wins, the West loses. So relatively speaking, Russia is stronger. So while Hezbollah, while Ansarullah, while the resistance does take hits, but the Israelis took the biggest hit. And the biggest hit was that it was exposed to the world.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah, I 100% agree, and I believe that as Russia has demonstrated, and I believe as Iran and the Axis of Resistance will demonstrate that, and what I mean, this is just history. What all resistance wars have demonstrated ever since um, the development of colonial powers and imperial powers is that it isn't a rapid war. It isn't a rapid military conflict. It isn't this kind of military to military conflict that ends it all. It actually is a process, as you said, that is really attritional in many respects, if we were going to use those military terms, but eventually it leads to the demise of the illegitimate force that is attempting to, exploit, oppress, and dominate those who are resisting. So I believe that writing is on the wall. But Professor Marandi, I wanted to get to a few questions before we depart here. You can answer them as quickly as you would like. I had a few Patreon members, and those of you who are watching can subscribe on Patreon and subscribe and submit questions to all of our guests. You can find that link in the video description. But Sean from Patreon says that he would love to hear you, Professor Marandi, talk about Iran's nuclear program and where the reality lies. So Sean is saying that he's heard that nuclear weapons are against Islam from Iran's perspective, and they are not now or not have ever been pursuing them. And we see what happened during the nuclear deal. But what is the reality? Is Iran pursuing weapons, and what? And that's what. Well, I'm just going to say, is it pursuing weapons? And there are many who are saying that Iran already has nuclear weapons, and that it is ready to build one in very rapid fashion should it need one. What is your assessment on this?
Well, Sean, Iran, if it wanted nuclear weapons, it would have had nuclear weapons a long time ago. If the Americans could make a nuclear weapon in 1945, the Iranians who have produced hypersonic missiles and whose drone technology is known everywhere, and missile technology, Iran can easily produce a nuclear weapon. But Iran doesn't want to produce a nuclear weapon. At no point was it producing a nuclear weapon, ever. It never had a nuclear weapons program, ever. And the Iranian position is that it's not a weapon that we should have. Why? Because remember, during the Iran-Iraq War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, the West gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons. Germany and other countries in the West gave the chemical weapons. The Americans gave the military intelligence, and Western European and North American countries, and Australia and New Zealand and others gave them the political cover to use them. Iranian commanders went to the leader back then to get permission to produce their own chemical weapons. He refused. He said no. And by the way, back then, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons at an industrial level, and Iran was sanctioned and prevented from purchasing even gas masks. My gas mask that I used, at least during part of the war, was a North Korean gas mask because Iran couldn't get it from anywhere else. So Iran does not want nuclear weapons, so that is the evidence. But But also, practically speaking, it's not a good weapon to have, because once you have it, other countries want to have it too. And we have a lot of crazy people in this region, just like we have crazy people in Europe and in North America and everywhere else in the world. We don't need country after country developing nuclear weapons, so we don't want a nuclear weapon. But Iran is a threshold state. There is no doubt about that. That is a form of deterrence, because Iran's enemies know that if they bring about some sort of existential threat to Iran, then circumstances would change. So a weapon that is illegal under Iran Islamic law and under, according to the fatwa of the leader, that fatwa could change under exceptional circumstances. That is something that if you look up Dr. Kamal Kharazi, who was the former Iranian foreign minister, and he's in the foreign one of the two foreign affairs advisors to the leader, he said this at least on 3 occasions when he spoke about the nuclear deal, about a nuclear weapon. He says Iran doesn't want one. Iran could have created one before, and Iran has no intention to have one. But if there's an existential threat, I think the phrase that he used was that Iran's nuclear posture would change. I'm not sure if that's the phrase that he used, but you get the point.
Great. And then just two more cool. Well, next one may not be quick, but you can answer as quick as you like. And then just one other one after that. The question is Professor Marandi from Valentina on Patreon. They're asking, what is the best way to learn about Iran? Do you have any specific books or documentary recommendations?
No, sadly, this shows how terrible Iran is at soft power, and it's very, very sad and disappointing. The Russians are a bit better, uh, but Iran is not good. Um, there's a book that I don't agree with on all its issues and everything that's in it. It's an old book, and some people are very hostile towards the book, but I think it's a good book in general, called Going to Tehran by Flint and Hillary Leverett. They both worked in the White House, and Flint resigned over the Iraq War in 2003. Hillary Leverett is Jewish. Both of them very decent people, and their politics changed and evolved. And they wrote this book, and they were punished for it because they were among the elites, and they got into a lot of trouble for the things that they said about Iran. That's a pretty good book, but I don't agree with everything in it, but and it's pretty old. I think it was written maybe a decade ago now. That's a good book. What can I say? They're like the Press TV website, Al Manar, the Hezbollah website. Uh, there are a number of news agencies in Iran, Fars News. I don't look at their English websites, but I know there's like Mehr News, Fars News, Tasneem. There are a few others. The IRNA, which is the president's the news agency that belongs to the government. I don't know if the president's website is in English. The leader's website, they have English. Sadly, there isn't all that much out there, and it's something that bothers me a lot. But hopefully, people like you will be able to find some good material and do what the Iranian government doesn't seem, or the state doesn't seem to be too concerned about. Sadly.
Right. Yeah. No, this is a big problem, especially for countries like Iran that have been under siege for so long, is that
That is true, by the way.
there is a difference.
That
Yeah.
is true. Yes, that is true. All of Iran's media is sanctioned. The sanctions have a lot of journalists are afraid to work with Iran because they can get punished, and they do get punished. That is true. So, for example, Press TV used to have a much larger audience, but because so many sanctions were imposed, and of course the sanctions which have been imposed on the country also prevent it from paying the sort of salaries, and when you're under sanctions, you have less capabilities. So and social media is also biased. I've lost my Instagram account. I've lost my Facebook account years ago, and so have many others. I'm actually in the process of writing a book with a friend about Iran, which hopefully will come out in a year or so. He's not Iranian, but we're working on it together. So hopefully that will be of some use.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, I think that we need so much more information coming out of that, and we in the collective West have a very big disadvantage too, in that our governments are consistently trying to keep us from learning about Iran, with very active measures, even to prevent things like travel and all kind, economic cooperation and the like. So it creates huge barriers, but I think we I think you gave some good suggestions, and definitely one method I take is definitely read Iranian media and then read the opposition media, if we call it that, the empire's media, Zionist media, and then you can compare what the actual situation, compare them, and then see what the situation, what policies, what actions are taken by these various forces, and then you can make conclusions. That can be one way to get the reality. But one last question for you, by Sparky. Didn't Hezbollah already switch to alternative logistics since it became clear that Assad had gotten a bit flaky in the last couple of years? So this is the final question for you, Professor Marandi.
Sparky, right? Well, I obviously wouldn't know. If I did, I would be wearing fatigues. But my understanding is that what you say is correct. That over the past 4 years, it's become very difficult for Hezbollah to and Iran to do much through Syria. It used to be different before, but the last few years that has been the case. But as I said, and since Iran respected Syrian sovereignty, unlike now where you have basically these foreign terrorists trained by Mr. Erdogan, who are now in charge of the army, the Iranian troops or affiliated troops in Syria were under the command of the Syrian uh, armed forces. There were no Iranian flags anywhere in Syria, and they obeyed the government and they respected the sovereignty at all times. And Iran never did any cultural work. I read somewhere once that like the Iranians can no longer do. I've been to Syria many times over the Iran never did any cultural work into because Syria, the Ba'athist Party, wouldn't tolerate it anyway. But Iran never got involved in anything inside Syria. They never tried, and they never did. But ever since, uh, so for the last 3 4 years, that's what you say has been true, and so the Iranians and Hezbollah have been using alternative means, and there are many means. Even Syria today is much more easy for Iran than it was 2 months ago, because 2 months ago Iran had to respect the central government. Now, if you pay someone to take these assets to the others to Lebanon, they'll do it for you. And the country is so broken that it's not expensive. How do you think? I mean, I don't know how Hezbollah, how Gaza is armed. I don't know how Yemen has been armed. But Yemen grew stronger during the genocidal war. Before the war, this genocide in Gaza, we had a genocide in Yemen where the United States, the Europeans, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of them were helping Saudi Arabia. The American Navy was imposing a starvation siege in the Red Sea against Yemen and Ansarullah. But the weapons got there. Now, how did they get there? They came through the sea or by land, but they got there. And this, the same is true in Gaza, and the same is true with Lebanon. So I would imagine, and again, this is mere speculation on my part, that you're right. I'm sure that they had their alternative means of getting what they needed, and they have those means. But I would also assume that today, using Syria is much more easy than it was 2 months ago. Not like 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the relationship was much better before the Saudis and the Emiratis pulled Mr. Assad in a different direction. But at least now I think my speculation would be that it is easier to use Syrian territory than it was during the last couple of years, 3 4 years, when President Assad was in power.
Yeah. Yeah. And my speculation over this, and we can close it here, Professor Marandi, is that Syria's government was not only eroded by massive sanctions, but by getting closer, coming back into the Arab League, which I believe was essentially necessary. I don't believe necessarily that distancing from the resistance was necessary. I think it was a terrible position to be in, and one where mistakes can only be made. The choices were not great for Syria. But that led to, I think, I mean, these are the very forces, Professor Maradi, that you had been following, we have been following, that were trying to destroy Syria, beginning in 2011, but not necessarily beginning then. But from 2011 onward, it was these Arab League leaders that were, with the United States' blessing and support, trying to destroy Syria. And so getting close to them over several years, many years, making concessions, perhaps deals in the back. Perhaps there were people inside of the Syrian government that were now no longer loyal to the project of an independent Syria anymore. Maybe they were okay with HTS and these 50 some odd groups backed by those who want to destroy Syria. Maybe they were okay with them walking in and coming in. That seems to me to be one plausible explanation for what happened. And it's one I've been thinking about a lot because we're just not getting a lot of good information. But what you said about Turkey not necessarily wanting to take on this huge responsibility, which seems to be true, even though people are patting them on the back, patting the government on the back for doing this, seems to point to, well, there were a lot of other forces. Of course, the U.S. is always involved in making this happen. And I believe that the consequences of it to the benefit of the empire are also going to be overestimated over the years. It's going to be quite a bumpy ride. But Professor Mario, we can close here if you have any final comments, and then we can head out.
I'd just like to thank you and your viewers, and again remind everyone, as I have a few times before, that we should always remain optimistic about the future. We are doing what's right. And the important thing is doing what's right. It's not necessarily achieving your objective, it's being on the right side of history, as they say, but it's more than just history, because it's right and justice and is a value in itself. So we should all remain optimistic. I don't see any real reason for anyone to be dejected, and resistance is always going to be tough. And but ultimately, we will overcome, and we will see better days for the Palestinian people. And we already see enormous change. You said earlier that the Israelis, the greater Israel. Who is going to populate that greater Israel? So many young Jews in the United States have turned very much against the regime, more than ever before. So many people across the world no longer see it as legitimate. No one is ever going to invest there again. It is just not secure. It's not safe. Missiles could strike any time at any time. High tech industries, they're not going to go back. So we are definitely seeing, in my opinion, we I have no doubt that we are seeing the beginning of the end of this regime, but that doesn't mean it's going to end next week or next month or next year. But it is swiftly sliding downwards, and therefore we should just continue to push and to remind people every day about the ongoing Holocaust and to keep up the pressure online, offline, and however it is possible for us to do that.
Indeed, yes. It's so important, and that's why here, Professor Marandi, we try to have conversations about the resistance, and also highlight that there is something to resist, which is exactly what you stated. This absolute Holocaust of the people of Gaza and Palestine. With all that said, everybody, we are going to depart. Please do hit the like button before you leave if you have not already. Go to the video description. You can find all the places to support this channel, from Patreon, Substack, and much more. I will be back for another episode on the resistance with rapper Low Key and I believe Rari Francis on Tuesday, July 14th. That's the next stream, be afternoon. With all of that said, take care, have a good weekend, and we will be back again soon as we approach Donald Trump 2.0. There will be no shortage of things happening following that. Take care. Bye-bye.